welcome to our second webinar in the series. This one will be about the real-life experience with Counter 5.1 from your fellow librarians. Welcome, Athena. Thank you for agreeing to this, and I'll give you the word.
Okay, let me start sharing my presentation. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today, or good afternoon if you're not in Orlando. I am in Orlando. I'm Athena Hoeppner, and I am distracted, disorganized, and busy. For the last 30 years, I've been at UCF, and most of that time it's been in some form of electronic resources librarian with different titles and reporting in different departments. But generally, I had the responsibility for making sure our links worked, making sure that our access worked, and also for any of the usage tracking. So I've been with CELUS and using CELUS since its very first version, and now we're on revision 5.1. So I've been through a few of these transitions before, and they've always been a bit challenging. This time it was a little bit easier and a little bit extra challenging in two ways for me. One is that for this year, became the interim associate dean over a division in the library, which meant that I was not as hands-on as I would have been in the past with the usage data and the transition. So I delegated a lot of the work. So I was very disorganized and distracted and busy this year. Um, so, but what I'm going to talk about is going from 5.0 to 5.1 in CELUS and what that looks like in terms of some of the management and decisions that I made. And I will be talking a lot about things that I did, but things that I would maybe do differently now because I've learned and because the tools have changed. And I'll also be doing, hopefully, a discussion of fiscal year 2025 with hopefully maybe a little bit of a live demo if I don't go overtime. Let me move this out of the way so I can see. And so enabling 5.1 in CELUS. It involves making clones. So let's launch right into that. So I do use CELUS. We've been a CELUS shop since, it was it 2022 or 2023? I cannot keep track of time, but we've been on CELUS for a while now, so much so that I don't really have procedures to use that don't involve using CELUS. So I know some of you are here thinking, well, how do I do this without CELUS? Well, I will talk about that a little bit. Mostly what I'm going to be showing is using this tool. And I was very excited early in the year, early in 2024, I should say, when I saw this clone to 5.1 appear. I knew 5.1 was coming. I was thinking, how am I going to do this? What will it mean? But this showed up and I thought, this is perfect. I can just click on this clone and it'll work. I have a screenshot here showing one of the sushi management pages, and it has a filter for safe to clone to 5.1. It shows you the symbol here that indicates that this can be cloned to 5.1. I'm seeing the 5.0. I can click this check mark, click clone to 5.1, and it will happen. Or I could just click this check mark where it says title, and everything will be checked, and I can clone them all at once. Very easy, right? And that's kind of what I thought I would be doing. But what I did was I tested a few of them and it seemed to work. It was great. And I asked my e-resources staff person who reported to me as the e-resources librarian and helps maintain our sushi credentials and gather usage. I asked her to go ahead and monitor that and to clone the platforms. And we went away and started and waited for data to become available for harvesting. That's the other thing that happened early on is the ability to clone the credentials sometimes happened before the ability to actually harvest data. It was maybe like a month before the data would be available in some cases. So sometimes when I wanted to test the data, I would have to wait. So I launched her to start cloning them. And what I ended up with later in July and August, when I decided it was time for me to do the annual report, was a little bit of a jumble. It was not a mess, but it was a jumble. So I looked and found that some of the platforms were still not 5.1 ready. Um, and some of the platforms that were ready, the person who reports to me has not yet enabled for 5.1. So there was some work to do there and some checking. I found that some of the cloned credentials were broken. And for those of you that have been managing Sushi credentials for a while, or even any database module, admin module credentials, you know that they break, they change. And if you're not right on top of it, you go to use it, and then you have to go hunt down the email that explained what the change would be, or do all the procedures to get your credentials working so you can log in and get your usage. So some of the credentials were broken. But the thing that sort of surprised me, there was really inconsistent start dates in terms of when the 5.1 harvested. And I'll show some of that in subsequent screens here. And there were a few instances of obviously wrong data that was harvested in the new 5.1 version. And then the biggest thing that I needed to tackle, and I suspect many of you are thinking about too, are the duplicate harvests. So let's look at these things a little bit more in detail. So, incomplete cloning of platforms. UCF has 91 platforms enabled in CELUS. 71 of those as of this week are enabled for 5.1. So there's still 20 or so that for some reason are not ready to go. And it could be that we have turned them off and we're never going to have them ready to go. Or it could be that the platform is just taking a long time, or they're not passing the audit. I don't know the reasons, but I know there's still things that I need to turn on in the future. You can track this. This is second part of the screen here is a screenshot of a tool that CELUS spun up that shows how many platforms they have working in their tool. So 215 platforms working in Counter 5.1. They don't show how many are with limited Counter 5.1. I don't know why, but 143 in the registry with limited Counter 0.1 and 106 are without Counter 5.1. And again, I couldn't explain why, but presumably they will eventually get there. So you can go to this page and get that information. I thought I had the URL, but it's disappeared from my slide. I apologize. So moving on to the broken credentials. This is one of the ones that is remaining. I have gone through, identified the credential problems and fixed most of them since July, August. But I noticed this week that Emerald is now also broken. I don't know if it was, I think it was recently some change to what they require. One thing I noticed is this site master URL. Let me go back. Did not mean to click. Is different. They used to be on LibLinks. Now they're on, I think, Silver Platter. I could have that wrong. Silverchair. Anyway, they've changed the host for their statistics, and this is a different URL than I used previously. So it updated, but I think my API keys may be out of date because of that. So I need to get those fixed and fix my credentials. So you may run into that as you do your transition, that there might be some change that needs to happen to make the new version of Counter work for you. And the inconsistent start dates for 5.1. So this is another screenshot from CELUS that you can go into. It's the, I swear I had a little footer that has somehow disappeared that told me where the pages were coming from, the names of the pages. But this is one of the pages in the sushi management area. And I can see that for most of my platforms, they have a start date of January 1st, 2021, where it started gathering 5.1 data, which is what I would have expected. That's great. But some of them have different start dates. This is further down in the same table. Some of them went ahead and retroactively harvested back to 2023, which was really unexpected, but very interesting. There are things that I could have done to manage that, and I will talk about those in just a second. But up here, I can see that there were some that had sort of oddball start dates. I have one that looks like it's in August or September, trying to line that up, and maybe one that's in, yeah, January 2024. It's just a little bit all over the place. So there's no real consistent start date for how far back the harvest went for 5.1. Now, here's one example that I only found one that was really, really obviously wrong data when it harvested in 5.1, and it happened very early on in the year. So I won't name the vendor that had this happen, but I see that it went for my unique item request in 5.1 from 1,792 to somewhere 752,000 for January 1st, 2025. Obviously, that's not going to be right. And later on, it sort of normalized out uh, and made more sense. Um, I went in and fixed this by deleting those months of data so I could run reports and have it not be completely wonky. And finally, the biggest thing that you all will be facing if you don't manage it differently than I did is you will have data that is harvested in 5.0 and in 5.1. So, for instance, here's the Taylor and Francis ebooks unique title request, and I can see that I have duplicate data for starting in August of 2024, but it doesn't look like it's quite rolled out right. But later on, it seems to normalize out, and I can see the data is matching up nicely, which is one of the advantages of keeping both of the harvest going, is you can watch for when it seems to start making sense, and you can say, okay, the older data is not really going to work for me, and I can delete it, or I can make sure that I'm not trying to use the 5.1 data, even though it harvested it. And I will use the 5.0 instead up to a point. So you need to ensure that when you're making your final reports for a time period that covers both 5.0 and 5.1, that you're picking the best data to use and you're not using or summing both of them, because then you'd end up with about twice as much usage as was really generated by your users. So I could have used a more careful approach. I went in and just pressed start, or had my staff just press start harvesting without doing anything to change what was happening with 5.0. So a more careful approach would have been to check and debug the credentials pre-cloning so that you make sure that everything is working as expected with 5.0 before you roll it over to 5.1. And then clone the credentials one at a time so you can see whether it's working. Now, you could say, well, I'm pretty confident that this set of platforms is going to roll over really well and do them in batch, but one at a time will let you spot problems if there are any at the time of cloning, instead of spotting them later when you're pulling the data. Um, one of the options that you can do in CELUS is set a last harvestable date. So when you're rolling over your credentials, you can say, okay, for the 5.1 version, I don't want you to try and harvest anything that's older than January 1st, 2025. So then you would know you have a very consistent start date for that. You can also turn off automatic harvesting for the 5.1. Probably you would do that for December 2024. And then you'd be good to go. There'd be no overlapping data. You can also choose to go and delete data that you no longer want. So if there was 5.1 data that overlapped with your if there was 5.0 data that overlapped your 5.1, and you're confident that the harvest is working properly, you can go and say, I'm deleting everything January 1st through the rest of 2025 in the 5.0 data because I have the 5.1. There's no overlap, no risk of reports trying to sum the data from two different versions. All right. And then you repeat this as platforms become 5.1 compliant. You can do all these steps with the orange asterisk if you don't want the overlapping data. Now, I'm not a very careful person, and I really like data. So I have not, for the most part, turned off the 5.0 harvesting. I've started it, I've contemplated it, I've waffled back and forth. It's a decision you can make. It depends on whether you're ready to try and manage it and have it in mind when you are pulling your reports. Okay, so here's some support portal links that you could use, and I will post these into the chat after this that guide you through some of these steps that I just said you could do, including debugging your sushi, how to clone your credentials, last harvestable month, and how to delete data. Very useful stuff. All right, so let's launch into what I did when I first went to use the data back in August to create my annual report. And I'll talk about unifying the 5.0 and 5.1 data that I had ended up with. So my goal is to end up with a report that looks sort of like this. I have a summary of the searches platform, unique item investigations, and unique item request. For each of the platforms, I have the summary data and I have my totals here at the top. And this is what we put into our library-wide annual report every year. I want it to be for the period of July 2024 to June 2025. So that's half of the year in 5.0, half of the year in 5.1, presumably. So this is what I did. I generated platform reports in CELUS. I did 5.0 and 5.1 separately, and I told it to show these metrics in the report and with these dates. And then I used Excel to work with the data. So I looked for oddities and then I had to go fix them, maybe run new reports for particular platforms to get data that made more sense, and use formula to pick which data source to use, 5.0 or 5.1. And this is what it looked like in generating the report. This is the screenshot of the CELUS Create Report screen. And you can see how I've set up my rows, my columns, my filters, and then applying those filters. And then I clicked run, and here is the data. Actually, there's a slight difference because I created this slide yesterday, and I went ahead and created a report that included both of these platforms. And one of the nice things that it does now is it has a column for report type. So I can quickly see which of the data rows is from which report or counter version. So that's really handy for next steps. Next. So then I downloaded all this data into one very big spreadsheet, and you can see I ended up, as I was doing the process, I ended up with a lot of tabs. So first, the metadata tab gave me a summary of how I generated the data. And then I plopped the 5.1 and the 5.0 data into the sheet. And I combined them into one sheet, used a pivot table to check things out, sort of eliminated platforms that weren't active anymore that I didn't want to include. And then this is the version picker tab where I've got all the data combined, and I've arranged it so that I have each month with 5 and 5.1 in columns, and then picked which one to use. So the use this column is using a formula that's basically saying if there's data in the revision 5 column, then use that. Otherwise, if there's not data in 5, then use the 5.1. I went too far previous. So why I use the 5.0 as my preferred data set, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I was able to compare and select which of the data to use, and use that then to sum it into a column over here for each of the attribute. Let me say that again. Each of the metrics. So this process is one that you could use even if you weren't using CELUS. You would have to go and get your data from each of these platforms individually somehow, or maybe you use a different sushi harvester and you can consolidate the data and then use a process like this to combine the two, even though you're working with the two different versions for one report. So my reasoning for preferring 5.0 when available is that 5.0 was the version that we had been using for the last several years. So I wanted this report to be more similar to the previous reports. I didn't want to have to think yet about how the 5.1 data might have changed some of those numbers. I I don't think they did. In retrospect, I went and looked, and there's not really drastic changes for the metrics I'm using in this report. I could have switched mid-year in my sums to say, oh, use 5.0 from July, December, and then switch the formula to use 5.1 from January to June. And that would have been an interesting approach. And I'd probably do that if I was going forward. The process, I wouldn't use that same process again if I'm using CELUS because it's gotten so much easier. They've added new features that make it possible for me to merge the data from 5.0 and 5.1 without the risk of summing data from the two reports for an individual time period, for an individual month. So there's more platforms that have been implemented. So I have more of the 5.1 data to work with. And I've fixed some of the platform data and oddities, and so have the vendors. So there's a lot of improvements that have happened in CELUS too. So, so this is what I would do now. And I'm going to see if I've got a, oh, I don't have time to do the demo, unfortunately. But I would have done a PR and pull a report which merged 5.0 and 5.1. And I would then have my rows be the platform, column be the metrics, and then filters be the metrics year and month. But I would pull two reports. I would do one from the December to the July to December 2024 and one with January to June 2025, and then do a quick, easy Excel with pivot to combine them. And I'm just going to really quickly show you that. My annual reports folder. And here's my demo. And I've pulled these reports. I saved them separately. I combined them into this file. And here it is. It just easily lines up. I can see that I have my 5.0 and my 5.1, and then some of them had both of them, but it selected which of the reports to use. And then I just ran a pivot on this that had my platforms as my row, my searches, unique item investigations, and unique item requests as my columns, and there it is. There's my draft for my table that I can work with. So it's very easy, much easier than the multiple tabs that I worked with in the previous way I worked. So some concluding thoughts, and then I'll hop off. The 5.0 to 5. Transition is still underway for many of the platforms. So I expect it's going to become more and more possible to work just in 5.1 going forward. But right now, there's also less than a year of 5.1 data. We're coming up on what should be a full year, but it's going to be a couple more months before we have that to really be able to compare all of 2024 and all of 2025. No matter how you do this, whether you use CELUS or not, maintenance and data checks are necessary to make sure that your credentials are good, the data you're pulling looks accurate, and that everything's good to go when you want to start pulling reports and interpreting the data. Don't have time. Okay, well, I will just conclude and say thank you.
Thank you, Athena. Thank you very much. It was great. I didn't know that you will be talking about CELUS so much, but it was very pleasant. Okay, I see lots of questions here, and you guys started also responding to each other. That's great. But we will leave this for the end of the webinar, and I would like to invite Betsy Tucker now, the electronic resources librarian from Kansas State University, who is also so great that she agreed to tell you guys how they deal with the transition in Kansas State. So, Betsy, welcome.
You. I've been told it'll take a minute for it to show up as a presentation, but it looks like it is now.
Yes.
Okay. My name is Betsy Tucker. I'm the e-resources librarian at Kansas State University, and I'm going to talk a bit about our counter 5.1 conversion. There we go. Okay. Took a second to hide the video. But first I'm going to talk a little about my role at K-State. I am more on the ERM side. I track vendor platform updates. I make sure electronic collections are properly activated and displaying correctly in Alma Primo. And my role with Sushi is similar. I don't do a lot of pulling reports or parsing data. I do more of the credential cleanup, making sure the reports run consistently, and then our content development department, who make our purchasing and licensing decisions, are heavily dependent on that usage data due to a chronically flat budget. So it's important to them that things continue to run smoothly. So naturally, when I thought about the timing of our Counter 5.1 conversion, I collaborated pretty closely with the head of CD, and she didn't have a lot of concern immediately in the spring. Implementation of 5.1 was inconsistent. Many vendors were keeping Counter 5 reports active through spring, summer 2025. And that made it easier to compare things for fiscal year 2025 renewals. So it was more convenient all around not to worry too much about Counter 5.1 unless a vendor had explicitly said they were turning off Counter 5 at a certain point. But by July, that had really changed. I noticed that Counter 5 was pulling a lot less consistently. And so I started switching all available vendors in CELUS to Counter 5.1. And I'll talk about some of the problems and the solutions that I encountered with that later. But for the most part, it was fairly easy because of the cloning function. I would agree that you really have to spot check, but it was a lot easier than it would have been if I had started in Alma. So the next thing I did was use CELUS data to switch the Alma credentials for consistent harvesting on both platforms. K-State primarily uses CELUS for parsing its usage data, but there are still a few analytics reports that back on good sushi data in Alma. And so it was important to make sure that both were running consistently. Uh, at this point, we're still working on a few problematic vendors. I think our percentage is about the same as UCF's. We have 114 vendors and 95 of them are running 5.1 at this point. But there are still vendors who either haven't switched to 5.1, have switched to 5.1, but it's not working correctly, or CELUS's metadata says they've switched, but I can't find any evidence that they have. So hopefully in the next year, we'll have about as full of a conversion as we can expect. So I'm not here to sell you CELUS, but I do want to talk about how CELUS made things easier. And I think the best way to do that is with comparison. So in August 2024, K-State had just adopted CELUS. I think we went live in June. Um, and I undertook an audit using Alma documentation on our own Alma vendor list to try and figure out which of our vendors had available sushi harvesting that we hadn't activated. There hadn't been enough bandwidth in the department to do that consistently over a few year period. And so many of our credentials were out of date. There were vendors we were still pulling Counter 4 for in Alma that did have available Counter 5 at that point. And we had some vendors that by some fluke had not made it onto the spreadsheet that we sent CELUS to initially activate our harvesting capabilities on that platform and that we needed to input manually. So that version of the audit took a month and it was very disjointed because I had to use several different pieces of documentation. Alma handles vendor platform records very discreetly. And this is not a criticism of Alma's ILS. The way that Ex Libris handles vendor platform records works really well for all the different things that Alma is doing. But CELUS, because it only does one thing, is better and more efficient at that one thing. So in September 2025, I did the reverse. I used data that I knew was up to date in CELUS because I'd just done that platform conversion a couple months ago, um, to set up as many 5.1 credentials as possible in Alma. And that process only took a week. Uh, there were still a few Alma vendors that I hadn't set up in CELUS for various reasons, but it was smooth for the most part, and it was really enlightening as far as figuring out how much CELUS had improved our harvesting capabilities, and how much it improved my ability to do that job efficiently. Um, so once, so as I was setting up credentials in CELUS, there were a few issues, even though I still think it was much easier than it would have been to start in Alma. There were a few common problems that I did encounter. So one was CELUS saying the vendor has available 5.1, but the sushi harvesting continuing to fail, for counter 5.1. So my solution to that was to start by checking the counter registry to see if they've marked the vendor as having available counter 5.1 harvesting. I know CELUS theoretically works off the registry's metadata, but every once in a while there is some sort of miscommunication there. If the registry says it should have 5.1, I check the vendor platform to make sure that there hasn't been a change in credentials or the harvesting platform. Like with Athena's Emerald example, there were a few vendors who took this opportunity to convert which platform they were using to harvest sushi, to harvest counter data. And if that's happened, it's really the only potential pitfall that I saw with CELUS's cloning ability. For the most part, it worked really well, but every once in a while, a vendor had made a major change and we couldn't use the same credentials anymore. And so we had to go in and fix that manually. If counter 5.1 really isn't active according to the registry or the vendor platform, then I've just maintained counter 5 reporting. There really isn't another choice at that point. And monthly, I check and see if the vendor has gotten their 5.1 to work, as they claim they have. A second problem I saw more often than I expected to was an individual report was broken. So it would harvest a DR and a PR, but I couldn't get a good TR from a specific vendor, for example. So again, the solution is to check the registry or the vendor platform, to see if the report type is available there. Because if you can't harvest it manually from the vendor platform, then odds are they didn't convert it over and it just didn't, and that information just didn't make it into my radar or to CELUS somehow. If it should be available, then I've contacted a couple vendors at this point, to see what's going on with their counter 5.1 conversion. There are still a few having some specific problems, though that has mostly faded at this point. It's much better than it was early in the year when I was starting to explore counter 5.1 conversion. And so a couple weeks ago, when CELUS updated to its latest iteration, there was a sudden breakage of several vendors. And it seems like the main problem there was that CELUS's automatic check harvest of new credentials goes back 24 months. And for many vendors, they don't have data before January 2025. So the December 24 report would fail. And at the time, CELUS seemed to mark that as not a huge problem. It was harvesting data successfully for 25, and they were going to ignore 24's problematic harvesting. But those attempts were marked as failed, and somehow, I think with the new update, that translated into those credentials being marked as broken. So in that case, I marked the credentials as fixed. I tested them on a 2025 report. I did have to delete and reharvest, so you may want data that's early in the year that's from a report you use less often. And then I reharvested, and for the most part, that fixed everything. They realized that that data was harvesting successfully, let the credentials be fixed, and we'll move on from there. So I guess in conclusion, I would say that CELUS, even though it's perhaps imperfect, has really been an improvement as far as our usage harvesting capabilities. Even when it comes to the issues I mentioned, those are things that it would have been hard to notice in Alma because of the way that it's set up. The fact that every single vendor platform is separate, that there's no one page where you can go and find every single report and see if it's been harvesting successfully. And so CELUS has really helped me get a good holistic look at the data, and that's made life easier for me and for content as we've moved into a new renewal season. And some of the new features will be even more helpful. Athena mentioned Merge. Our head of content development has been kind of just cobbling together Counter 5 and 5.1 data and figuring out how to make that work. And that will be a really, so that will be a really good change for her. But otherwise, I am open to any questions anyone has about either my process or about our use of CELUS in general.
Okay, thank you very much, Betsy. I see that Athena already answered the questions that were mostly aimed to her, but we have one open question here, which I think can be to both of you. Anonymous attendee is asking, does your library use Alma? Did you also set up harvesting in Alma or whatever system you use as well? You already spoke about it, Betsy, but if you can repeat it.
Yes, we are Alma users, and yes, we do set up harvesting in Alma as well. But we've really moved to using CELUS as our primary platform for reporting. But I think it's good to have a secondary source of data if, for whatever reason, CELUS reports break. And also good to be able to compare and make sure nothing strange is going on with the sushi harvesting on either platform.
UCF is also an Alma shop. And we started early on entering our sushi credentials, but it was to get meaningful information out of it from Alma, you have to use the Alma analytics. And we were just implementing Alma at the same time as we were rolling in these sushi credentials, and none of us really had a handle on what to do in Alma analytics yet. And CELUS was coming out about the same time, and it was so much easier that we just went with that and never really followed up in getting the Alma version of harvesting really doing anything meaningful. I know there are some experts out there who do great things, and they can have it do automatic cost per use calculations with the data from their invoices and PO lines. So it's a great option if you know how to do it or want to learn how to do it. I think we're going to stay with this tool because we're all distracted, busy, and don't really have time to dig into it. One other thing, though, following up on having a backup, we have been using for a number of years the Counter 5 tool from the University of Prince Edward Island just to have our own local repository of the tabular data. So we run it once or twice a year to just go and pull those reports so we have them stored. And it is really great to have that as a backup.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I would also say that one place where CELUS really has a leg up on Alma is its ability to harvest non-counter usage data. So we've been able to look at statistics for Canopy for the first time, for example, because Alma has no way to harvest and parse that data, but CELUS does.
Yeah, it was just to clarify harvest is not really precise because we can't harvest them, but you can manually upload your reports from non-counter publishers. Yeah, just so somebody does not expect sellers, to automatically magically harvest reports from non-counter. Okay, we are
That's what I
good.
mean.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
apologize.
No problem. We have some more questions coming up. So we have a question from Gwen. What has your experience been with JSTOR? Ladies, does anyone want to comment on that?
I've been noticing the problems with JSTOR being reported on the ERNL discussion list. I have not checked it out for ourselves. I haven't noticed a problem um, in our reports that I pulled earlier this year. I'm happy to hop in and check right now and let you know what I see. But yeah, we have not had weird issues with JSTOR, so I wonder what's going on with it and if it's brand new this month, and I just haven't seen it yet.
Okay,
And
maybe Gwen or somebody else will add something to that question. In the meantime, Johanna is asking Athena what was the backup you were using because she missed the name.
I'm going to post a link to the GitHub. It's an open source tool by Melissa Bilvati and some of the students at her institution, the University of Prince Edward Island. And it has been fantastic. Early on, it is what got me going with sushi before Alma, before CELUS. Um,
So just a quick question, Athena. So
Thank
am I
you.
right that you want to like back up all your counter data like at once? Like one button that will harvest, or I mean, download all your title reports, database reports, and everything locally. Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, it is. I want a tool that will let me have on my hard disk an archive of the tabular reports. So I don't need any tool other than Excel. I suppose I could go with JSON now. Excel has gotten really good at being able to handle that format as well. And I know I can pull those reports off of CELUS, but
But one
we've
by
got
one
this.
only, as you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So
we were thinking about it to make it available for all the platforms, like in a click of a button. So maybe
yeah.
we'll put it a bit higher in the priority list.
And it doesn't have to be month by month for this. We usually do either 6 months at a time or year at a time of the data. I don't want it month by month. That's too many files.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think the way we will make it, if we're gonna make it anytime soon, will be you'll define the date range, like let's say 12
Yeah.
months, and you will get it all in one
Yeah. And you
click.
can specify
Yeah.
show the monthly details.
Yeah.
Okay, since Christoph is here, I'm gonna read Lynette's question. Is anyone using the ACRL specialized report? Is there one for 2025 data? I don't see one for 2025. I'm not sure now, but Christoph, you know.
That's a very good question because we heard that the iPads has somehow it's getting deprecated or not mandatory anymore, and there is no specification, or at least we are not aware of any new specification for 2025. So the old specification defined that we need to use counter 5 data, but it doesn't say what you are supposed to do when you have both, when you have counter 5 and 5.1. So if there is anyone who can share with us some more deep, I don't know if that exists, if there is a like a general rule how to behave or what to do when you have both 5.1 and 5.0, what to do in iPads. Do you know, Athena or Betsy?
No, I'm shaking my head because I honestly think that they don't pay attention to counter well enough and they don't listen to e-resources librarians well enough to it's kind of problematic every year trying to figure out the best way to comply. So I would be very surprised if they had this in mind when they were creating the report. I probably shouldn't have said anything because this is my gut sense and I don't know with certainty.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Well, I can come back to JSTOR. Gwen says it's specifically about item reports. Well, with item reports, it's a whole different story. What we did in CELUS is that we check every item report which is published by the publisher, and we check it if it's correct, and only then we allow to harvest them into CELUS, because the thing is that the numbers from the item reports have to be consistent with the title report, and if they are not, then it will mess up your data completely. So CELUS only allows those who are really checked that the data is correct to be harvested into CELUS. So that's how it is with item reports. And so far, the last question here. Will CELUS add the ability to input cost data so cost per use can be generated in the platform? Oh, Christoph, you want to take this one?
No. Well, we were thinking about this for ages, and so far we weren't able to come up with a solution that would satisfy most of our users, because everybody, oh, Athena can spend the whole day on this topic, I suppose. Like every university has a slightly different approach and does things differently. And for us, we still weren't able to figure out what's the best way forward. And it starts with how to get the data in and how to match it and all these things. So I wish I can say yes that we will make it, and I hope one day we will make it. But honestly, there is nothing specific. I mean, there is nothing in the pipeline besides thoughts in our head. We don't have any specific roadmap regarding cost per use, unfortunately. But maybe we can finally, if some of the attendees are interested, maybe we can like gather or set up a smaller working group, like a user group meeting where we can discuss this a bit further or in more detail and maybe figure out, or we of course have some ideas how we think it could be done, but we have absolutely no clue if it's what you would like it to be, if it's the way you do your cost per use. So we probably need to hear more feedback from you, and maybe an open discussion or like a user group meeting in a small scale meeting might help figure this out. So if you are open to this, just let us know and we can organize something to discuss this within a community of users interested in cost per use. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There are no other questions. So I will just remind you guys that this series of webinars will finish next week at the same time, with me and my colleague Kamcha talking about our experience with the transition from 5 to 5.1, because we have seen many, many credentials, many JSONs, many failed reports. So we will try to add something which was not said yet. For those of you who are maybe interested in CELUS, you can always start your free trial. Just go to our website, celus.net, and you can start a free trial there. No credit cards, nothing like that. Or you can just ask us for a demo at ask@celus.net. Thank you very much, Betsy. Thank you, Athena. It was a pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your day.